This meeting is being recorded and it will be available on the Volusia County Environmental Management YouTube channel. This is a publicly noticed virtual meeting, and I'd like to just let everyone know that no governmental policy will be made tonight. No official decisions will be made during this forum. This forum is hosted by the Green Volusia program, which is a county initiative to provide information about environmentally responsible practices, encourage stewardship of and conservation of natural resources. The program is part of our Save Our Springs and Rivers initiative that's funded in part by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And I'd like to welcome Katrina Locke, who will give our welcome. She is the Sustainability and Resilience Manager for Volusia. Katrina, thank you so much for hosting this.
Hi, just before I start, just a reminder, I know Kelly's already mentioned it, but just a reminder to folks, if you are not muted, if you could mute yourself, because somebody sounds like they're not muted and there's a little bit of background noise going on. So just a quick reminder, and maybe, if it carries on, we'll just mute you. We'll mute you, but you'll be able to unmute yourself. All right. I just wanted to say good evening to everybody and welcome you to the Save Our Springs and Rivers education series. Thank you all for joining us and joining our local experts as they discuss the challenges and benefits of instituting low impact development strategies into our structures and our community design. I want to thank any elected officials who are on the meeting and just say thank you for their service to our community. So we'll start and then just to give you some background, so the Save Our Springs and Rivers series, as Kelly mentioned, is a cooperative project that's been funded in part by the United States Environmental Protection Agency through a Florida Department of Environmental Protection non-point source pollution grant. The focus of the grant initiatives are to provide residents with information about the sources of non-point source pollution that are negatively impacting Blue Spring and actions we can take, all of us, to contribute towards the solutions. These actions are replicable throughout the county and they'll make positive impacts on our water quality. So you may have seen our Time to Change the Way We Go education campaign, and that was a marketing campaign designed to provide facts about the impacts of septic tank nutrient pollution. You may have attended or heard about one of our Save Our Springs and Rivers water quality academies. Well, this is our low impact development workshop piece of that grant initiatives. So tonight and over the next week or so, we're going to talk about low impact development, an approach to land development or redevelopment that works with nature to manage stormwater as close to its source as possible. And through these workshops, we hope to enhance an understanding of the value of low impact development and green infrastructure as a way to prevent pollution from entering our surface and groundwater bodies, and as a way to provide us with a buffer for storm and flooding conditions. Now, I've said this before, that low impact development isn't a new concept, but we have started talking about it more because of nutrient pollution and because of how it can be incorporated into development to reduce the impacts of flooding from storm surge and sea level rise. Reducing non-point source pollution and being resilient is about us all working together as a community across jurisdictional boundaries and working towards solutions to reduce our impacts on our environment. So as you participate in the forum, I just want to say, please think about practical applications of low impact development and how the information and the techniques that you hear about tonight, and hopefully if you join us over the next week, can promote healthy communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly McGee to introduce tonight's forum and to introduce Dr. Eban Bean.
Great, thank you so much, Katrina. And thank everyone who has joined us this evening. This was, really by popular demand. We had a low impact development workshop in March, and this topic, cost effectiveness of low impact development, was something that kept coming up as something that needs more discussion. And so we're really hoping that tonight's forum will be food for thought and will help us move forward and continue the dialogue. And so we're just really happy and honored that Dr. Eban Bean with the University of Florida is joining us this evening. Dr. Bean is an assistant professor and extension specialist in urban water resources engineering and is a member of the Sustainability, Human, and Ecological Development Group. He specializes in stormwater management, water quality and quantity issues, low impact development, and sustainable urban development to reduce non-point source pollution. Dr. Bean's research program focuses on the design, evaluation, and management of urban landscapes for water resource sustainability. And his extension program focuses on urban stormwater management and how the design and management of drainage networks can be more sustainable. Dr. Bean received a PhD in agricultural and biological engineering from the University of Florida and is a licensed professional engineer. Good evening, Dr. Eban Bean.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Kelly. Thank you for inviting me to be here and speak to you tonight about low impact development and the potential that it has, and maybe to dispel one of the biggest sort of myths about low impact development is that it's more expensive, and that's not always the case, although it can be. I'll get into more of those details now. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If everyone can see that just fine. Yeah. All right. Great. So let me kind of start off just kind of giving an overview of what I plan to cover tonight. I want to start out with sort of, a little bit of background on sort of conventional stormwater management and why that approach, what are the drawbacks and limitations of it, and then sort of transition into what low impact development, green stormwater infrastructure, what those really mean, because those terms are kind of used in many ways interchangeably. And I think it's really good for us to separate those and understand what each one of those does. I've also pulled together several case studies, and hopefully what you'll see through that is that there are generalized themes within each of the projects for how the cost saving emerges from low impact development. Okay, so when we get to that, I'll probably remind you about that, but just try and think about what is the theme? Where is that savings actually coming from? We hear, you hear, low impact development is more expensive. Well, how does it become more expensive? Well, we have some ideas, I'm sure, but how do we save money when it is cost effective? How does that actually occur in that process? And then finally, I'll touch a little bit on maintenance and the aspects that go along with that. So let's talk first about sort of the conventional approach. In many of our residential areas, the typical development style is to essentially clear cut the site, master grade it. You put in your utilities, put in the roadway, and the drainage approach is to essentially get the water off site as quickly as possible, kind of into the nearest storm drain and into a stormwater pipe system that then carries it to a stormwater pond, whether this might be a stormwater retention pond or a stormwater detention pond. Basically an area that will basically capture the increase of runoff that comes off the site and basically deal with it, so to speak. There's several things that the stormwater pond, several functions that it has that are critical. So when we are developing a site and adding impervious cover, roadways, rooftops, we're increasing the amount of runoff that comes from a rainstorm. Okay, and so that can have downstream effects, and some of these are, for example, higher runoff rates. Okay, so the stormwater ponds are there to essentially capture and release, or capture and infiltrate stormwater runoff, so that we don't have a flash flood or a high flow that comes off of this developed site. And we're also looking at flood control. So this increased volume, so not just a rate, but the volume that's coming off of the site. How do we deal with that additional volume so that it's not flooding the homes and also not flooding someone that's downstream? It's all great to get water off site as quickly as possible until you're the one that all that water is coming to. Okay, so that's how we end up a lot of times with flooding. And then there's another aspect that's been incorporated that we've found has maybe not been as effective, and that's the water quality volume, or the water quality approach to stormwater ponds. Maybe I think it was 20, maybe 30 years ago, sometime in that time frame, water quality was basically, stormwater ponds were grandfathered in for their ability to treat stormwater runoff for nitrogen and phosphorus removal. And so that water quality volume is something I'm going to come back to. And here is sort of a breakdown of the size of rainfall events that stormwater ponds are designed for, or the scale of rainfall events that stormwater ponds are generally designed for. You know, and we're dealing with stormwater runoff from events that are 5, 10, 15, 20 inches. These are massive events. You know, these are hurricanes. These are sort of, you know, and literally in these cases, 100, 200, 500-year storms, 1,000-year storm. This size of an event is maybe a once in that system or that pond's technically lifespan, okay? But we have to control the flooding up to a certain level. And usually the minimum is controlling up to the 25-year event. So for here, if we're in the area of Daytona Beach, this is somewhere around the 9-inch storm event for a 25-year, 24-hour event. A 100-year event would be higher, and so forth. But essentially 9 inches of rain, that's a lot. For example, we just got about 8 inches from Elsa that came through Gainesville at my house. And that's been basically the most water we've gotten in, and even from more than what we got from Irma. So, you know, it's major events. But from the water quality standpoint, what we see is that stormwater ponds are designed for these large events, typically for flood control, but they aren't meeting up to the performance that they're credited with. So, for example, they are credited with getting 80% removal of nitrogen and phosphorus. And the basis for this was essentially that, you know, if stormwater ponds can remove about 80% of sediment, okay, the thought was that nitrogen and phosphorus would be removed in similar fractions. The difference is that while sediments are particulates and solids and kind of settle out of the water column, nitrogen tends to be more in a dissolved fraction, and much more so than phosphorus. Phosphorus has some fraction that's particle bound, and so it does tend to be removed a little bit more efficiently than nitrogen. But we see, for example, in this bottom left-hand corner, that the removal efficiency of nitrogen at about 40% here gets nowhere near this 80% requirement that it's supposed to be treating, okay? And the way that the rules are structured is that stormwater ponds, if they're built to a certain criteria, they automatically get that credit. And so we see, you know, 80% removal, we're nowhere near that with stormwater ponds. And if we look at phosphorus, we get there after a very long detention time, essentially an unrealistic detention time. And what we see as well is that the concentrations also are not really getting down that low. We only have, for example, with nitrogen, we get about 25% reduction in our concentrations of in stormwater from the inflow to the outflow of stormwater ponds. A bit better, 2/3 reduction from phosphorus. But this is essentially, you know, a growing problem that has a lot of legacy effects. So the way that we've been doing stormwater management, and continue to in many cases, is continuing to affect our waterways. So if you take a look and compare these two maps, the one on the bottom right is the areas that are developed in Central Florida, okay? And the green areas and the different shades of green are basically the undeveloped and ag areas. And if you kind of contrast that with the areas, the map on the left should see that there's a little bit of a correlation with where the red areas are and where the gray areas are. And the gray areas indicate water bodies or watersheds for water bodies that are impaired or not meeting their intended use for one reason or another. Now, this isn't absolute, but in general, what we tend to see is that impaired water bodies tend to follow urbanization. Now, runoff is not the only source of contaminants and nutrients to our water bodies that goes along with urbanization. And you know, to some effect, you know, septic systems, depending on where they're at, depending on how they're maintained, And depending on their density can also have an effect and impact on water quality. But particularly in the highly urbanized areas, we tend to see that those small water bodies, those small watersheds are heavily impacted by stormwater runoff in a multitude of ways, either through the addition of nutrients that are not being removed through stormwater ponds or lack of stormwater management, or through bacteria and other contaminants that can impair water bodies. And if we zoom in and really just look at Volusia County, there's a lot of issues going on. In this case, we have just about the entire county is kind of covered in either a TMDL, BMAP, or some other type of plan that is essentially meant to reduce or mitigate the impacts of whatever activity is going on at the surface. Some of these may be agriculture related, some of these may be wastewater or septic related. But many of the water bodies you see, particularly in the Daytona Beach area and growing from the area out from the Central Florida, Orlando area, a lot of those are in urbanized or urbanizing areas. And the way that we're doing stormwater management is not going to continue to protect those water bodies or do anything to improve them in most cases. So with that essentially leads into why we need to have a paradigm shift in many ways. And it's the ironic thing is that, as Katrina said, LID is not something that is brand new. It's really been around since the late 80s, early 90s, kind of pioneered in Prince George's County, Maryland, and some other places were doing some similar things. But essentially, it's just a change in the approach to site design and understanding what the site offers and trying to work within that. I mentioned early on that I wanted to sort of separate these terms, LID and GSI, or low impact development, green stormwater infrastructure. A lot of times these terms are used interchangeably, but I hope with these definitions you'll kind of see that there's a difference. It's subtle, but it really is critical to the whole development process and where these come into play in the development process. So low impact development is essentially a comprehensive site planning and design strategy for maintaining the pre-development hydrologic regime. So what that means is we're trying to basically mimic the amount of water and the way that water leaves a site between its pre-development and its post-development condition, okay? And we're also trying to mitigate the pollutant loads from that land development. We do this by distributing the structural and non-structural techniques into the watershed, into the developed area. And it's key here. The goals of LID are to avoid and minimize the additional runoff that's produced from the site development process. So this really comes into play in the planning stage and really kind of conceptualizing what is the site going to be used for, where are areas going to be utilized for different purposes, avoiding certain areas and using other areas. Green stormwater infrastructure, GSI, is a term that's come along in maybe the past, I'd say 5-10 years, probably. It's a slight deviation from green infrastructure. So this is green infrastructure that's specifically for stormwater management. And this includes the range of structural and non-structural retention and detention measures that have hydrologic functions of infiltration, evaporation, detention, filtration, and storage of stormwater runoff, typically very close to the source where it's being produced. And the goal of GSI is to mitigate the runoff that's produced from the site development. So LID is essentially the precursor and the way that we go about avoiding and minimizing the runoff that's being produced from the site that's being developed. And then once we have basically minimized how much runoff is going to be produced, we implement GSI to mitigate that effectively, addressing the water quality and the flow issues on the site. And together, I kind of use the term LID plus GSI. So that's kind of, there are a lot of different terms and definitions that go around out there. But I think this kind of settled on this one as being pretty effective. So the cost of low impact development, does it save money? Is it more expensive? Well, it's going to depend. Okay, it's going to depend on a lot of factors. Every site is going to be different, and that's a really big or broad answer that we get when the general question of, well, is LID cost effective? Well, it depends. That's an easy way of kind of avoiding the answer. But I hope to provide you with some ways that certain projects do save money and what the strategies are, how they go about implementing LID that result in reducing runoff and reducing the costs. Okay, and the EPA has even put together several resources, some of which I'll touch on here. So let's get into a little bit of detail here with this whole the planning stage in LID. And I'm going to be perfectly honest. The content on the next this page and a few others that I come across at the very bottom here, I will blatantly say that I stole it with Tom Singleton's permission from his from a manual that he put together for Winter Haven, and this is verbatim. But I have gotten approval from Tom to steal, to use, and abuse it. But I think he just did a really great job hitting the nail on the head of what the key steps are here, and I want to pass those along whenever I'm communicating this. So the first step, when we're looking at avoiding the impacts, basically we want to map and protect whatever the green infrastructure is on the site. Okay, what are our depressional areas? Where are the forested areas? Where are the areas that have a lot of value and resources? So the first thing is to preserve open spaces and natural areas, including recharge zones, aquifers, springs, lakes, rivers, estuaries, whatever water resource bodies are sensitive or could be impacted by development. Preserve and protect those. Maximize the retention of native forest cover and restore disturbed vegetation to restore the function, intercept, infiltrate, evaporate, and transpire precipitation. When we think about the undeveloped landscape, there's a lot of, we see all this pervious area, no impervious cover, but most of that water that falls on that site actually gets uptaken by plants and then put back into the atmosphere. Evapotranspiration is a huge flux of water from once rainfall has hit the ground. It goes into the shallow soil and gets held there temporarily. Plants then take that up and put it back into the atmosphere. Very little runoff is coming from these undeveloped sites. We also want to preserve the permeable native soil and enhance disturbed soils to store and infiltrate those storm flows. So basically enhancing the storage that soils have on the site. So those pervious areas, let's enhance the functionality of them. Retain and incorporate natural drainage and topographic features and patterns that slow and infiltrate stormwater. So where does water flow when it is running off the site currently? And how can we preserve those natural drainage features, the intermittent channels, the paths that water wants to take, that it's going to take, so that we're not altering the hydrology as much. Maintain pre-development hydrology, again, looking at the peak discharge and volume, the water balance. Okay, what happens to that rainfall in the pre-developed condition, and how can we maintain the ultimate sort of endpoint of that water so that it's, after we develop, it's going to the same sort of distribution. Now, to imply that you have to do every single one of these would be an overstatement here. In each development, each site's going to have more or less resources or more or less constraints. The key here is to try to implement these as much as possible on each site. Okay. So a couple examples here. When we look at this is a development that was proposed in East Central Florida. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's not too far from Volusia County. In fact, it may be in Volusia County, I believe. Yeah, but it's a site called Restoration. The original site design, if you look on the west side, the west side of this site essentially was a lot of wetlands that were in existence, a lot of poorly drained soils, and the site that was being proposed was essentially basically spreading out and utilizing the full site environment. That was sort of the conventional approach. Went back to the drawing board, worked with some folks here at, in our program for resource efficient communities and some others to kind of re-envision what this site could look like and taking the LID approach here. And what you see on the right is essentially what they came up with. They were able to essentially, through compact design and compact development, concentrate the disturbance of the site and the change in the overall site hydrology to the east side. And it basically snugs up against I-95, which is on the eastern boundary there. What this did was it preserved those wetlands. What you see in the brown area in here was if I recall correctly, was basically a trail system, or that's trying to use the recreation areas. But this also allowed for the wetlands to maintain their hydrologic function. And what we see is when we have large flooding events, large rain events, the wetlands flood, right? And that's where the water should be stored, okay, and not be stored in our residential areas or in artificial structures, or at least we can use those wetlands for that large storage. The ways that they basically went about, the key points here are that they preserved a lot of the open space. You can see that the site footprint shrank dramatically, okay, and that's a key point here. And it ends up saving a lot of money when it comes to your site clearing. You save a lot of money on your impervious cover that you're putting in, your roadway lengths, your stormwater pipes, the length of pipes that you have to run all over the site to connect everything. If you have a smaller site, you're saving money by not having as much length of stormwater pipes. They clustered the design and they built vertically. And so that was the design. Now, this was all, if you remember correctly, this was sometime in the 2005 to 2010 timeframe. And so as soon as this site redesign came about, there was the economic crash, slowdown. So it has not been built, but this was the site plan that they settled on and were planning to move forward with. So just some examples here of site planning. Number one, kind of getting away from the master grading, the complete site clearing. That kind of ignores what resources are on site. And to be honest, that first step of site clearing and site grading kind of sets the course for the overall site. And that really starts at the planning point. So if the plan starts with clear cutting and master grading the site, you're kind of already locking into what likely could be a more expensive drainage system, because you're going to run pipes all over the site. You're going to have all this area that you're going to need stormwater ponds for. Okay, preserving those natural areas and looking for ways to consolidate and condense the development, not reducing the number of units, but just looking at how the development can be more compact and preserve and limit the disturbance. If you're limiting the site disturbance area, you're limiting the area that you have to manage the stormwater runoff that's coming from. Okay, and you can kind of see sort of there's a lot of different iterations of this, but just on the right, a comparison between what a conventional site design might be and then what a low impact development site design might be. We're limiting the amount of roadways here. You see that we've got two basically islands in the LID design, but we've drastically shortened the amount of roadway that's here. We've got a lot more open space and a lot more area that's basically remaining in conservation. Okay, and those areas of conservation oftentimes are utilized for either recreation or for storage, large storm, flood management, and so forth. Utilizing those natural vegetated site depressional areas for what they kind of do anyway, which is collecting a lot of the stormwater runoff when we have these large events to manage it on site. Moving into sort of the second part of this, which is sort of the minimizing the impacts. So you've gone through and sort of identified where the critical resources are on a site and looked at where you want to avoid and protect areas and tried to compact it as much as possible. The next step is looking at how do we minimize those impacts, basically fitting the project to the site rather than trying to fit the site to the project, which is oftentimes where we see the disconnect that comes in. So the first thing here, step 6 is reduce, minimize, disconnect, and eliminate impervious surfaces to maximize infiltration. So if you think about going back to the conventional site development, maybe think about your own home, because this is pretty prevalent across wherever we are. A raindrop that falls on the rooftop, your roof, and flows over the roof. Maybe it goes into a gutter, or maybe it falls onto your driveway after it falls off the roof, then flows into the street, and maybe down the curb and into a storm drain inlet and through a pipe, and eventually goes into a stormwater pond. Never has the opportunity to actually infiltrate into the ground. We've kind of basically removed that as an option, if you will. So one of the biggest things that can be done to mitigate that or minimize that is minimizing the imperviousness. And then if there is imperviousness, disconnecting that imperviousness. So basically looking for opportunities to still infiltrate into the ground in one way or another. We also want to try and control runoff at the source, manage stormwater as close to its origin as possible. Again, using these small distributed hydrologic controls, minimize the runoff by maximizing these hydrologic processes, infiltration, evapotranspiration, filtration, and storage. And then creating sort of this is a neat way of kind of phrases it, creating a hydrologically rough landscape that slows the storm flows and increases time of infiltration. With soils, the amount of water that it can take in is going to be dependent on how fast, based on the soil properties. So its infiltration rate. If water is moving across it too fastly or moves by it too quickly, it also doesn't really have an opportunity to kind of work its way into the ground. Having a longer residence time or a longer flow path through the development allows for more other processes like infiltration and biological treatment, chemical treatment to improve water quality and reduce those volumes. A couple more here are to employ natural processes for water quality improvement. Again, extending that time that the water is moving across the landscape, increase the reliability of storm systems, providing multiple redundant runoff controls. So, when we talk about sort of these distributed stormwater practices, it's not just spreading it out across the whole site, it's also creating redundancy. So if one practice fails or we have an issue and needs to be taken offline, we have a storm event, well, the overflow from that oftentimes goes into, in these LID sites, goes into another practice downstream before it still gets treated. It still gets an opportunity to be infiltrated. We want to integrate stormwater controls into the development design and utilize the controls as amenities, and to reduce the reliance on traditional conveyance and pond technologies. And finally, develop reliable and long-term maintenance programs with clear and enforceable guidelines to make sure that these practices are functioning over their lifespan. So what do these non-structural practices look like? We talk about reducing the impervious area. It points to, we look at a shortened driveway. We don't have to have necessarily a really long driveway that goes down all the way, separates the house from the street. This is saving impervious area, reducing the amount of runoff here. We have a vertical construction here where we could have had sort of single story construction, but here we've gone to 2 stories, cut basically our footprint just about in half, and reduce the amount of impervious cover. Creating sort of these areas that are near where the source of runoff is being contributed. So for example, rooftop, instead of having gutters, if we can avoid it, it's flowing instead of into impervious cover or onto a roadway or into a drain. And we have these natural areas that are off to the side of the lot where that water can collect and infiltrate. This is a curb cut, just a very, very simple design that allows the water that's coming off of the roadway to exit and then come into this natural area to infiltrate. And then maybe one of the most common ways that this is done or realized, with maybe not even being intentional, is through the implementation and use of swales. And swales and bioswales, and we'll get to sort of the difference between those, but swales are a great tool. They're impervious, which is different from a stormwater pipe. The water that's in there is held in there. The stormwater swale allows infiltration as water is flowing through it. And any sort of depressional areas kind of capture and hold back water and allow that to infiltrate without it flowing downstream. And it also, again, kind of provides this disconnection of that impervious area, providing another opportunity to reconnect the hydrology of the site. Kind of just some more examples of disconnecting the impervious cover, where basically right along the roadways. This is also in the right of way, which allows for it kind of avoids having your stormwater management practices encroaching on individual lot levels or on individual lots where maintenance may be an issue, or a homeowner might decide that they don't want that swale or that rain garden there on their site. Okay, so if it stays in the right of way, we have function, and these linear systems can be rather effective. Traffic islands, this is not as common in residential areas, but if you'll see these in a lot of commercial areas and parking lots, where essentially we're taking advantage of the opportunity that's there. And in this case, it's not really what was there before, but what's being typically designed and incorporated into your parking lots and into your site designs. So leveraging those areas where it would have been just a grassed area, maybe elevated, and instead turning it into a depression, allowing some of that water to go into an area and collect and infiltrate on the site. In addition, this picture in the middle is probably not it goes against what I'm about to say, but it can create an opportunity with GSI by incorporating, for example, a rain garden or bioretention cell in these islands, to where you don't have to do mowing of that infrastructure on a regular basis. Okay, there's different maintenance that goes along with it, but oftentimes it's less intense. Now, I include this picture though because at the end of the day, you can have a bioretention or a rain garden or a swale here that is grassed, and it provides a function. It may not be as easy to maintain. It may not be as effective in certain cases, but it's still an option if you have to go with that. So then the third part that that I've stolen from Tom in this way is getting at then the green stormwater infrastructure. So part one was avoiding the increase in stormwater runoff. Part two was, hey, we've tried to avoid as much as possible. Let's minimize the amount of runoff that's being generated. And then part three here is essentially, how do we mitigate the runoff that's being produced? Green stormwater infrastructure and looking at different types of practices. Now, not all of these practices are going to be realistic for all situations. And I'll come back to sort of the compatibility between GSI practices and sort of the development setting a little bit later on. But you can see sort of some examples of common practices that are used, that can be used and integrated into developments. Now, I want to say one thing. Ideally, we like to see LID and GSI kind of coupled together, but you often will see that LID is disconnected from GSI. And what we really see oftentimes is that we'll see an implementation of GSI without really the site design and planning that comes from LID. So, for example, I went to a recent, pick your big box store, and essentially what I'm seeing is what we see oftentimes, or more commonly now, is that they are making the transition where they don't have the raised islands. They have those medians in the that are lowered and kind of used as an infiltration trench, and that's being used to capture and convey some of their stormwater runoff. Now, did they minimize and avoid areas for site development? No way. So they're utilizing the entire site and the impacts and the increase in runoff is what was pretty typical, whether they had used that GSI or not. What they are doing is kind of incorporating it a little bit more, and so it's baby steps, I'll say, but it's not. So we do see implementations of LID, usually with GSI, but sometimes we'll see a lot of times where GSI is used, but maybe not with the LID planning that goes in. Kind of coming back to this diagram that I had earlier, and this really gets at sort of green stormwater infrastructure. You know, this is the size or the range or the scale of storms that our stormwater ponds are designed to be able to manage or capture and convey. You know, we're looking at, you know, storms that are on the order of several inches, tens of inches, over certain, you know, several hours or over the course of a day. But if you look at the actual distribution of rainfall events, so this is, it took the rainfall data for 30 years from Daytona Beach Airport here, and basically took their daily rainfall, anything that was a tenth of an inch or more, and just ranked it and looked at what the percentage distribution was. And what we see here is what we see in a lot of places, that the overall majority of stormwater events that happen on a regular basis, these small events that transport pollutants from the watershed into our stormwater ponds or into our water bodies, they're pretty small. So for example, in Daytona Beach, about 80% of all storms that would produce runoff, that's where sort of that 0.1 inch comes in. If we have less than 0.1 inch rainfall, really don't call that a runoff producing storm in many cases. So if we have 80% of those storms are, you know, an inch or less, we're not talking about a huge volume. We're not talking about this massive volume that a stormwater pond needs to manage. So for these regular storms, 80% of storms, we're talking about pretty small volumes that need to be captured, filtered, infiltrated, or managed, moving it through the site. Okay? And kind of, you know, it's interesting sort of how it kind of lines up. Sometimes, you know, they hit right on sort of certain values. So if you want to remember, 80% of the rainfall in Daytona Beach, 80% of those events are about an inch, 90% is about an inch and a half. And then you get to about 95% is 2 inches or less. So it's an easy way to kind of remember that. This figure is where I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the compatibility of green stormwater infrastructure with certain development zones. I'll talk a little bit about the cost of permeable pavements in a little bit, but oftentimes that's kind of used as an example of, oh, well, LID is too expensive. Well, yes, in certain cases. I wouldn't use permeable pavement in a rural or low density residential area. It just doesn't make cost sense unless I can reduce or eliminate a stormwater pond, or, you know, or the cost of land is really high. Okay. Same with green roofs. I would even say that the figure here kind of showing that green roofs are in general urban zone might be a little bit generous. And I'll show some examples of why green roofs, they're just not the best option for stormwater management or GSI from a purely cost perspective. But you see that as we move from different development styles or development densities, that we have different types of GSI practices that get integrated into that landscape. And you kind of think of the roadway cross section, what kind of fits within the available space to give that functionality that we need for stormwater management, these regular small scale storm events to protect our water quality and manage sort of those larger storms as well. So you'll see sort of there's a transition there that occurs. I like this figure because it kind of goes into a way of thinking about that these GSI practices a lot of times are kind of different repackaging of similar functions. When I think about GSI practices, I think about their primary functions, and that's what needs to be maintained. That's what needs to be emphasized, and how do we incorporate that function into that landscape or into that development area. And so, for example, we may have from over here on the high end, or the high function end of treatment, constructed wetlands, infiltration basins, bioswales, that basically do they have a lot of biological treatment, but they sort of are repackaged at different scales, different functions. We have permeable pavement that is primarily infiltration trenches, rain gardens, tree box filters. It's all kind of the same primary function, but it fits into the landscape differently. Permeable pavement is our typical impervious areas. Tree box filters and infiltration trenches are sort of your linear areas where a lot of that water can infiltrate. Permeable pavements, as I mentioned, I'll be honest, permeable pavements are one of my favorite GSI practices because it allows you to basically park on, drive on your surface while also having stormwater management within it. And it's probably my favorite practice. If you look at porous concrete or porous asphalt, the way to identify it is that if you look really close, it basically looks like a Rice Krispie treat. So that's how you can kind of identify it. Permeable pavers or pavements are a little bit different, where the infiltration occurs between the pavers themselves. Typically, there's usually a gap between them. But when you get below the surface, porous asphalt, porous concrete, or pavers, the profile is pretty similar. You have typically some different stone aggregate layers that essentially have a porosity that is meant to receive rapid infiltration of rainwater or runoff, so that it can be stored and built up, usually within a depth of about 14 to 16 inches, somewhere in that range. And then that water is allowed to, over time, kind of slowly infiltrate into that subgrade soil. We have an extension document, an EDIS document, if you go on IFAS, that basically goes into the technical considerations of permeable pavements and goes over a lot of factors. And one of the main ones is costs. And kind of looking at sort of how these different types of pavements, how their costs range. And what we see is that, the pavement surface, there's a difference between looking at just what's at the pavement surface, so the actual porous asphalt, pervious concrete, that material that's just at the surface, and then considering the cost of system installation. Now, again, this is going to be more expensive than your conventional concrete or conventional asphalt. However, that's not really comparing apples to apples, because your conventional pavements also have to have sort of a pond or some other type of stormwater treatment to go with it. The real comparison is looking at this cost compared to the conventional pavement plus the cost of the necessary stormwater pond or other stormwater infrastructure. Bioretention is another common practice that is easy to incorporate into the landscape. Oftentimes these are, kind of the vegetated depressional areas. You can basically make use of existing depressional areas or construct your own, or construct them in the design. The primary function here is to capture and then rapidly infiltrate. We want these to basically infiltrate within about 24 hours. This avoids them becoming sort of ponded and stagnant, becoming mosquito pits and so forth. If we have sort of soils that are not well drained, we can put in an under drain, and that can help to reduce that time that it takes for water to draw down. And there are several different ways to kind of do the configurations that I'll talk about in a minute. Vegetated swales. So these are, you kind of see these in a lot of rural areas outside the urban perimeter. And these are essentially, ditches, but they provide a lot of functionality, or they can, through conveyance, treatment, and infiltration. A lot of times you'll see these again in a wide variety of settings, but those functions are pretty similar across the board. They can be very cost effective as an alternative to stormwater pipes. This is basically incorporated into the site, or the master grading, or the right-of-way grading, and the conveyance occurs in the swale rather than through stormwater pipes that have to be basically installed underground and convey between the 2 points. Bioswales are kind of a mix between bioretention and swales. This term is, I hate to say it, but it's often used maybe incorrectly. Bioswale has some very specific features to it that make it different from a swale or bioretention. So it's vegetated like a swale. So at the surface, oftentimes what you see is sort of short vegetated grass. This helps to the rooting system of the vegetation and the uniform coverage prevents erosion from occurring. It reinforces that surface, allows infiltration and treatment, though, like bioretention. So if you notice on the figure, there's a layer of media here that is essentially bioretention media. This tends to be high infiltration rate, but it has a mixture of organics and fines that help the water to be treated, but also to filter as it migrates through it. And then it's like a swale, though, because the water is moving through a linear system, and there's oftentimes an underdrain through here, so that once the water has passed through that engineered media, it goes through this underdrain pipe and into stormwater system downstream. This is sort of an example of one that we have here in Gainesville. It's a little bit more urbanized than a residential setting, but it kind of shows sort of how this can be implemented into a very narrow space, a narrow right-of-way, and still have quite a bit of functionality. Essentially what happens here is you can see that there's a row of bioswales or cells upstream here. Water comes straight off of the impervious area. It overflows these little half walls as water builds up in each cell, and the upstream and downstream cells are connected by a pipe underneath, and there's an underdrain pipe that goes underneath the full length of the system. Cisterns, we're kind of getting into sort of a more to practices that are more appropriate for higher density or higher urbanized areas rather than your typical low or medium density residential areas. But cisterns can be a very useful practice, particularly when it comes to water conservation. And there's several different ways that we can do rainwater harvesting. So for example, in these settings, you can have cisterns or large tanks that are above ground or below ground. And for example, the cistern or a reservoir of some type, we have these sort of bags, they're sort of large bladders that can go, for example, underneath a deck and fill up with rainwater and then be used for irrigation. That can be a water conservation method for homeowners. But essentially these tanks can be above ground or below ground, but the main issue, the main concern is making sure that there's a use that is dedicated to using that water that's captured on a regular basis. So making sure that volume is recovered in between storm events so that they can be, that volume is available to capture. Nutrient separating baffle boxes, it's kind of borderline whether it's green stormwater infrastructure. It's a good way of integrating several different processes into a stormwater pipe system or kind of a retrofit. It kind of functions by water kind of coming in from on the left here. Oftentimes we'll have a mixture of vegetation, organics, sediments, and oils and greases. A lot of the larger debris can be captured in that screen. Sediments will drop out in these different chambers. And then a boom or a skimmer can kind of hold back a lot of the floatables. And it's a pretty cost-effective way an efficient way to remove a lot of pollutants pretty quickly or pretty effectively. Subsurface exfiltration is another practice that I see being used quite a bit. This is typically for areas where we have higher property values, similar to permeable pavements, but maybe in a little bit more, a little bit higher price range, depending on the site and the constraints. Essentially, what we're looking at is we have these half pipes that are installed just below the ground surface that have 100% porosity, just completely open. So it's really effective and efficient at being able to capture a large volume within a small footprint. This network of half pipes and drainage infrastructure is essentially, put down in the ground. We have a filter fabric that's underneath the half pipes, a stone base layer separates it from the subsoil. And then on top of this, it basically gets filled on top of with a stone aggregate layer. And then we build the parking lot or whatever roadway on top of that. And so the runoff from that area goes right below it, and it can build up very quickly and then infiltrate over time there. One of the things that we look for in a lot of practices or a lot of sites is to integrate multiple practices. So for example, it's oftentimes not just looking at, okay, well, let's just do this one thing very well. This site, for example, integrated into a residential condo apartment complex, if you will, a couple different practices. Permeable pavements. So you can see sort of the permeable pavement in the upper right-hand corner here, as well as here in the walkway or the drive path. These are pavers, and this is porous concrete. If I zoomed in a little bit more on this picture, you can see sort of the interlocking or connected aggregates with the pore spaces in between those aggregates. And then here is actually a cistern. So overflow or water that passes through this permeable pavement then collects into a cistern tank that they pump out to use for irrigation. Again, pretty high density development, high land costs for this to kind of make sense. So green roofs, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. So just to kind of to touch on this, green roofs are essentially trying to create a very shallow vegetation cover on the rooftop of buildings. The idea is that there's a certain volume of water that when the rain falls down, it's captured into this thin soil layer. Typically about an inch of water can be captured, but some of the larger implementations might have a deeper rooting depth, up to maybe even a foot of soil medium. And then that water that's captured in the soil will then be taken up by the plants, evapotranspirated into the atmosphere. The key is that we need to have special types of plants that can kind of handle the droughts that occur here in Gainesville, and I imagine it's probably similar in Volusia County. We have sort of a dry period that comes every May, and so we might have a really wet spring, March and April, but as soon as May hits, it basically shuts off, and then when June comes, the floodgates open. So we need plants that can kind of tolerate that, those two extremes. And so they've been implemented in a lot of different locations. Oftentimes these make sense in extremely high value land areas where there's no other place to kind of put your stormwater management but on the roof. These figures, I apologize that they're not as clear as I would like to, but if we look at this kind of gets into the cost of green roofs, and I'll just point out that the practices that are shown here are basic infiltration paver or permeable pavements, cisterns for irrigation and indoor use. The light blue is green roofs, and then the orange here is biofiltration. The graph on the left is the cost per square foot of imperviousness that it's receiving. Okay, and so we kind of look at this as a cost per area of treatment, and within all of these different development settings, the cost is much higher for green roofs. It's the highest one across the board, so it's not the most cost effective one. And then when we look at just sort of the cost per gallon of stormwater, so based on the volumes, it still doesn't really come out as being the most cost effective. But just kind of a difficult, it's a unique setting for where green roofs make the most economic sense, but definitely not really applicable to residential implementations. Okay, getting into case studies. This really gets into sort of the brass tacks and where LID saves money. I'm going to be perfectly honest, there's only a few example case studies from Florida that I could find, but the trends and the ways that LID saves money in these other example cases And these have been implemented. These are real cases around the country. The way that the LID saves money is pretty consistent. Okay, and hopefully you'll pick up on that. Conventional site design on the left. This is a residential development, and this is in New Hampshire. Not really relevant again, but essentially the conventional site design was impervious pavement. You've got 2 stormwater ponds that are basically receiving all the stormwater that's flowing through stormwater pipes, kind of collecting it from different points around the site and funneling it to those areas for the treatment. The alternate design was to, instead of using impervious pavement, they used porous pavement. So it allows the water to drain through and infiltrate into the subsurface, capture some of that volume. They also had swales and a fewer catch basin. Notice there's much less or much shorter length of overall stormwater pipes on the site. So that should be a little bit of foreshadowing. So when we look at the comparison between the conventional design and the LID design, the difference was that the LID design avoided 1,616 feet of curbing, 785 feet of storm pipe, 8 catch basins, 2 detention basins, 2 outlet control structures, and 1.3 acres of land clearing. Okay, so all of those kind of add up. Now, remember, they use permeable pavement though, and that's more expensive than the roadway. This is a good example here though of where it comes in and makes sense. Site preparation. So this is the cost here is looking at, the grading, the clearing. We have less area with the LID, so we have a less cost with site preparation. Temporary erosion control. Well, we have a smaller disturbed area, so our temporary erosion control is less. Our drainage, we reduce several things as far as stormwater ponds, our catch basin inlets, and all that infrastructure. Roadway was a higher cost, and that's because they used a permeable pavement, okay, or porous pavement. The driveways were also porous pavement, okay, so those costs increase. But just looking at those 2 items doesn't look at the whole site, okay. Curbing, we eliminated the curbing from the LID design, okay, saved us $6,500. Permanent erosion control, we were able to save again another almost $20,000. Additional items that kind of came out in the wash, the buildings stayed the same. Those additional items are basically the same, but overall they saved basically $49,000 on a $4.4 million project. So overall, 6% savings on total costs of the infrastructure for what was a 0 discharge site. Okay. Here's a photo of what it looks like after it was constructed as an LID. Notice no curbs. I said porous concrete, but this is porous asphalt. The swales that you see on the sides are collecting the runoff, and so forth. So one example there. The EPA has a document that kind of covers a lot of case studies that they end up being from a lot of areas that are kind of in the north of the country. And I'll get to sort of a side point as why are these case studies so hard to find. We'll kind of answer that in a little bit, at least why I suspect it is. But this document did a nice job of kind of going through and working out the costs for conventional development versus LID and what those cost differences were. Now, if you're looking at these numbers, there's probably one of these sites that's like really standing out, and it's probably Kensington Estates. Holy cow, they increased the cost from LID by $737,000. The price difference was almost double for the stormwater management. And I saw that and I was like, what in the world? What happened here? Why is this the case? And when you look into what the LID comparison was, again, I'm not sure it's apples to apples when the LID proposal included rooftop rainwater collection systems for every house. It's not the approach that I would take or recommend that's most cost effective. But you look at all the other ones, and I'll go through some of these of how these are saving, where the money savings comes into play. This is sort of a breakdown of the tables here, and I apologize, it's kind of going off the bottom of the page there. But essentially, what you have here is each project, and so we have sort of on the far right is the overall project savings with the conventional design compared to the LID and GSI. The site prep, this is basically your site grading, your clearing, and so forth. Your stormwater management, that's your stormwater pipes, anything that's basically meant to manage, capture, treat, convey your stormwater runoff. Site paving, your impervious cover, your sidewalks, anything that's not dealing with the actual footprint of the home or the buildings. And then we have landscaping and some miscellaneous costs. Now, not all of these had 100% of the costs. And you'll notice that the location for these are clustered in Washington, Wisconsin. So again, not the best representation of Florida, but there are some trends that come out here. Number one, we have Kensington Estates, and we see that the stormwater management, the red numbers are were more expensive for the LID. And so there's the explanation there. But then when you look at the overall stormwater, the stormwater management and the percentage of the savings, where that's happening, whether site prep, stormwater management, site paving, I've bolded anything that was above 50%. Okay. So what you should see is that the cost savings really kind of occurs in the stormwater management and some of the site paving. So the cost savings, essentially what's happening in these sites across the board, is that you're either reducing the cost of your stormwater infrastructure, reducing the pipe length, reducing the size of the ponds in your conventional system, and it's not being offset or overcome by the types of practices that are in LID and GSI. The other side, the second most popular one is site paving. All right, now the one that's red here, the negative 142, they had basically overused a very specific type of pavement in this site. But still, with the stormwater management cost savings, they didn't, they actually came out as a cost savings. But with site paving, if we're able to reduce our impervious cover, reduce our pavement, reduce our curbing, that's typically going to be your second largest savings on site construction and site implementation. When we look at the overall sites that, what were the types of practices that worked at this site? So in this report, I've read it out or kind of highlighted those sites that were not really included in, they didn't line up with this, this analysis for one reason or another. Either they weren't residential or the costs were on like a per site basis. So for example, here, we see the different types of practices that are being used. Here again, here's our Kensington Estates, the one that use the rooftop water storage for each house, not recommended for being cost effective. But if you look, if you look at each of the ones that are still white, what are the commonalities here? What are the types of practices that are being used? And we see that almost all of them are using a reduced impervious area. That occurs in the planning stage, in the site layout. We're looking at, we have swales. So we're offsetting our stormwater pipe costs with swale conveyance through swales. Bioretention, we're getting some of that storage and capture and infiltration distributed in the landscape. And only a few of these are residential for the most part. Only a few of these use permeable pavements, okay? And this was, again, sort of that Garden Valley that had that really high pavement cost. The permeable pavement was partially to do with that, okay? So I have a few case studies to kind of report on that are from Florida. Student Daniel Penniman kind of did this work for his master's, and there's two from sort of our region, so to speak. The first one here is Central Florida residential project in Lake County, kind of made it anonymous and for good reason in some ways that I'll get to at the end. The site was 170 acres, had projected to have 493 new residential units. The soils here were decent, you're pretty average, your B soil, so you might think of a loam having moderate amount of fines in it, not a heavy clay, not what we'd find in the Panhandle, but not like a well-drained sand. The depth of the water table was not, it wasn't well drained. You got kind of some areas where 3 to 6 feet is kind of getting into, it's going to start to affect some of your options that you can do for infiltration on site. So how did this break down? So the conventional design was to have essentially 3 centralized retention basins. And this required 750,000 cubic yards of grading and 14,000 linear feet of stormwater piping. By comparison, the LID GSI design was 26 shallow storage areas. You can kind of think of these as bioretention areas or rain gardens. These are mostly connected via your vegetated swales. And they preserve 51 acres of existing green space that they use for recreation and basically your large volume storm events, stormwater management. So this saved them basically 300 cubic yards of grading and 12,000 linear feet of, in this case, the pipes that they did put in were smaller than the conventional design. So overall, they saved the total just over $2 million from the site here, which for the site grading was a 40% reduction, and for the stormwater management was a 92% reduction. So great. Again, this is another site, similar sort of case here. This is in Newberry, which is just west of Gainesville. The soils out there, pretty coarse, sandy soils, high infiltration rates. You see there 2 to 20 inches per hour. The average depth of the water table on the site, well drained, way below the surface. The conventional pipe and pond technique was used for this site. That's sort of your typical stormwater drainage. 34 acres of retention ponds were part of that design. For the LID GSI design, they basically connected a lot of these large open green spaces via sort of they called them storm trails, but they were essentially dry detention areas and stormwater conveyance that incorporated basically in with bioretention basins. The key is that it helped them maintain 55 acres of green space, and 33 of that they used for the recreation and stormwater infiltration. So we're able, again, use what was available on site to limit their area of disturbance, to limit their grading costs, their site prep costs, to limit their stormwater management costs. And overall, in this case, through the reduced need for culverts and retention facilities, saved just under $3 million. So why is it so hard to find examples of cost savings using LID, right? Well, I'll put it this way. I had this discussion with Tom Singleton, and in the Winter Haven documents, they have a few sort of redesign projects that they show the examples of how, and none of them were residential, but they were mostly high density urban, downtown, commercial kind of sites. And we got into this conversation, well, man, why is it's so difficult to find these? If you think about it, let's say that you're an engineer and you've designed a site and put it in place and for your client, and they built it, and then you go back, or someone else goes back and redesigns it with green infrastructure, and lo and behold, you could have saved your client 20, 30, 40% in the site development costs. I don't know many engineers that are going to jump on that. Okay, so it's difficult because there's skin in the game with that, right? So every site is different, but I hope that what you're able to see from these case studies is that where the cost saving occurs, it's pretty consistent, and how that kind of emerges is pretty consistent. Just to talk a little bit about stormwater maintenance, I'm getting pretty close to the end here. One of my favorite quotes that applies to stormwater management is that another flaw in the human character is that everybody wants to build and nobody wants to do maintenance. Filters clog, plants die, and sediments build up. These practices, whether it's a stormwater pond that has a 6-foot fence around it, or is a rain garden, or is a green roof, or whatever the practice is, all of them require maintenance at some point. And not doing maintenance is essentially just deferring it. We see that with the approach to LID and green stormwater infrastructure, where we're distributing these practices, we're looking at how do we maintain that function. So I use an adage called 3 Fs: the function, the failure, and the fix. So what is the function of these different practices? What is it supposed to be doing? Well, it has to infiltrate. It has to overflow properly. We have to, looking at those types of maintenance activities to restore the function is critical to do on a regular basis, and to maintain that performance. A couple of points on maintenance. So it's important to kind of compare apples to apples again. So when we look at costs for LID or green stormwater infrastructure, oftentimes it's, oh, those costs are so high compared to a conventional stormwater pond. We don't have to do maintenance on our stormwater pond. That's not actually true. Unmaintained stormwater ponds have those maintenance costs, but they will come due and it will eventually catch up, and it doesn't occur until it's a crisis for the HOA or for that development to where they need to do it. Green stormwater infrastructure is in the landscape. It's kind of open, kind of tends to be part of the active landscape. Those practices are going to be seen and observed. So when there is an issue, it's kind of good that it's easy to identify and easy to see what's happening, and the maintenance can be done. Stormwater pipes oftentimes are, the cost of those to replace can be pretty significant. Looking at sort of where a lot of the cost savings is when you compare sort of conventional to LID, big majority of that cost was in the reduced stormwater pipes installation costs. It's important too to consider the life cycle of the system. So routine maintenance, a lot of times it depends on the practice. So I hesitate to use broad generalities like it can be higher for LID and GSI. It's true, but in some cases it can be lower. It just kind of depends on what that comparison is. But generally the replacement costs are lower for LID and GSI. And that's where that overall savings comes into place. So, there's sort of the frequent maintenance that needs to occur. Consider it sort of the plant replacement for plants that might die on a year-to-year basis, okay? Or kind of patching an area of erosion that might be in a stormwater pond. Those costs tend to be higher for LID and GSI. But when it comes to having to overhaul a whole stormwater pond or having to replace stormwater pipes, the cost of the LID GSI practices are much lower. So those end of lifespan projects, that's where that cost savings comes into play. And I'll just make a note here that we are in the process of, we've submitted a proposal to DEP to develop a GSI maintenance program where we would train basically the folks who are already in the landscape. So if you're familiar with the GIBMP program that a lot of landscapers need to have, the idea is to essentially train those folks who are in the landscape already on a regular basis to identify failures of the GSI and to train them on how to fix those types of failures that they find to restore that function. And so we're hoping that that gets approved by FDEP and gets started later this year. Just want to kind of put a plug for Winter Haven Resources. This is sort of over on the right, sort of an example of where they were able to redesign a site that was actually the conventional site on the top, and then the lower cost LID site on the bottom there. But this is sort of their site for Winter Haven. They've done a fantastic job with some of their technical resources there. Yeah, and so this was another example just of the cost comparison. In this case, a commercial site, a CVS, I believe, that they had done there. But by distributing the stormwater ponds on the site using the natural drainage of the site, they were able to save, in this case, $44,000. And again, those costs came from the reduced stormwater infrastructure that was needed. So that's where those costs are going to come into play. So to summarize and kind of wrap up here, can LID and GSI cost less? Absolutely. But can it also cost more? Yeah, if it's done incorrectly, or you want to put water harvesting on the rooftop, yeah, that doesn't work out. I also wouldn't recommend things like permeable pavement when it's unnecessary. It looks nice. It looks really nice in a lot of places, but it may not be appropriate. It may not be most cost effective. LID is, if you think about it, it's the planning stage, and that it's really critical that this takes place, at the beginning. Avoid increasing runoff and impacting the site resources. Minimize the stormwater runoff that's going to be generated, disconnecting impervious areas, limiting those disturbed areas, utilizing the existing depressional areas for flood control. Those are the ways that the cost savings gets realized. And then with GSI, these are the practices that basically manage what runoff comes off the site. And so we're looking at, bioretention and bioswales are pretty cost effective when it comes to swapping those out for using typical piping that needs to be that's with conventional development. Green roofs not very appropriate for residential applications. So and in only a few cases is that going to really pay out for itself as far as being cost effective. But in the right situation, permeable pavements can definitely be cost effective in the right situation. And finally, maintenance is key. We don't like to do it. We like to just kind of set it and forget it, but maintenance is key. And we're working on some ways to make that more a part of the just the general landscape maintenance that goes on when those GSI practices are in there. So with that, I will take any questions. And notice that the number in the chat box kept increasing as I was talking, but I apologize, I did not see any of those.
That's okay.
So I'm a little worried about what's coming.
No, it's wonderful because we have been moderating and reading those questions in the chat box as you have as you've been going. And it's funny because a lot of the questions that were asked, the very next slide, you provided the answer. But we will go through some of those questions. I see that Wendy, Dr. Wendy Anderson has her hand raised.
Hi, Wendy.
So Wendy, I'm gonna pitch it over to you.
Wendy,
Sure.
good to see you again.
Thanks. It's good to hear from you, Eban. This was really informative, and it's exactly what we've been dreaming of hearing about. When we launched kind of an introductory webinar about this back in March, we had a huge attendance. Kelly, I don't remember how many were actually participating. Maybe, I don't know, dozens and dozens. We weren't over 100 maybe, but it included a lot of elected officials, a lot of people from city and county engineering and growth management departments, developers, developer attorneys. I mean, it was a great audience. And one of the questions or assertions or critiques that came up was that it's more expensive because they have to do both. If they want to do LID, they still have to do conventional as well because, and I'm skeptical, because St. Johns River Water Management District requires them to still do the conventional infrastructure. And so I find that hard to believe because, I think St. John's is actually trying to get us to do LID. At least Jennifer Mitchell and Deirdre Irwin are really promoting that. So why would they be promoting it on the educational side, but not actually kind of honor about that with, from the perspective of the water management districts, if they're actually working with the project engineers to help us move in this direction?
Yeah, this is probably one of the more common issues that comes up. And I really hope that currently FDEP is in the process of meeting with they have the Stormwater Technical Advisory Committee that will be making recommendations for FDEP to update stormwater rules. And I hope that this is a particular aspect that I'm about to mention that gets addressed. Essentially what they're talking about is that with green stormwater infrastructure, any practice that you want volume credit for. So and what I mean by volume credit is basically mitigating the increased runoff from these large flooding events or capturing and discharging it. Anything that you want credit for that right now, you essentially have to model each and every implementation or practice, every rain garden, every infiltration trench, every practice. That is that tends to be a hurdle, or it's not it disincentivizes or discourages engineers from taking that approach. That being said, well, one thing, I hope that that the TAC and FDEP look at addressing this in a way that kind of eliminates that. You know, you have a bioretention on one side of the street and you have one on the other side of the street. There's a lot of ways that we can look at kind of making some assumptions about, you know, this one, how it's going to work, and extrapolating to this one and looking at sort of how soils are on a site. I hope that gets addressed. With that being said, so if you're not getting volume control in your green stormwater infrastructure on the site, then what happens is you still have to deal with that volume. And so what ends up happening is stormwater ponds are kind of the default practice that developers go to. Now, let me back up though. If you're limiting, but this is usually coming into play after the site has gone through the planning and site layout process. You know, they're not looking at how do we reduce the footprint of the development first, how do we minimize the disturbance. We're looking at, you know, a lot of times the perspective is how do we maximize what we can do on the site? How do we look at the entire site as whatever we want to do with that site? But a lot of that, you know, there can be a lot of things that can be, there's a lot of reductions in the runoff that can occur and get credit for by disconnecting imperviouses, for example. That's definitely built into the manual and ways to get your stormwater runoff credit. So yes, there is a bit of a hurdle that does need to be addressed at the water management district / FDEP level, that I hope they'll figure out a way to address it. But it's not an end all be all. It doesn't prevent them from doing LID. It takes a little bit more work, and a lot of engineers have basically figured out how to do it in a more efficient way. I'll be honest, if you know, there's a little bit of an inertia that needs to be overcome with asking somebody to kind of do things differently than how they've always done it. So that's probably another factor that comes into play as well.
Those are great answers. Thanks for walking through that.
Fantastic. So we also had a question from Melissa Lammers early in the presentation. So would you describe a man-made wetland system as GSI?
Yes. You know, it kind of gets into splitting hairs, but yeah, it's green, being that it's vegetated and so forth, and implemented to manage the stormwater that's coming from a developed site. The vegetation, you know, is, you know, treating the vegetation soils and the functional processes that are going on in the wetland are doing that treatment. And it's functioning as, you know, stormwater infrastructure. So yes, it will be one of the main types of GSI that I would say. It's not as common because they can be expensive to get the land area. It's kind of a unique situation for a wetland to be the most cost-effective choice.
Interesting. So
we see a lot. Sorry to cut you off, but we see a lot of there's a lot of constructed wetlands that are being used to treat and polish treated wastewater effluent around the state. A lot of implementations of that going on right now. Particularly, yeah. I'm about to go off on a tangent, but
no, that's fantastic, because actually, you know, we're gonna talk about that on Thursday at our workshop, and we did a little video tour with Dr. Anderson And
Great.
she showed us, she walked us to different stormwater ponds, and one of them is that exact type of treatment where the gray water is coming into sort of a man-made wetland, and then all of the sort of challenges of, okay, so the aesthetics, of that, and dealing with the increased nutrient load is a really sort of interesting case study there.
I'll tell you just a real quick, in Gainesville, they've done that, where a historic area that didn't have any stormwater management, basically, they put a stormwater wetland at the bottom of it, but they also put it in to polish basically treated wastewater from the downtown wastewater treatment plant. And it was put in for these functions, but it also has become the most visited park in all of the county. It's the only one you have to pay for. It's this huge amenity that, whenever anybody comes to town, it's like, oh, we should go out to the Sweetwater wetland and go see all the wildlife and everything. There's a lot of examples of that.
It's funny because that's the exact example that Melissa Lammers had in her question
Yeah.
about wetlands. So that's interesting. The next question that we had is a sort of a technical question. And this is from David Hamstra, and he's asking, do you feel maintaining pre-development hydrology should also mimic the timing of the peak? So I think that's getting to sort of, flow and volume.
Yeah, I don't know that it necessarily needs to be the timing of the peak. Yeah, trying to get no, because I mean, if you're doing detention, well, yeah, I don't think that you necessarily need to match the timing of the peak. That isn't as important. The way that timing is being used there is more kind of the frequency that events occur. So think if you're familiar with like sort of flow duration or discharge frequency, it's kind of getting at that type of an approach, looking at how do we mimic the water, for example, the inputs into a stream downstream that would be similar to the pre-development response, so that the stream is not impacted by excess flows or higher flow rates going, or reduced flows if we're holding back too much water. The goal, you're not going to get it perfect, but the goal would be to kind of mimic that discharge that's coming from the site in one way or another.
Excellent. The next question came up when you were talking about the restoration plans. The restoration is the name of the development in Edgewater. And the question is, so DRIs, which Development of Regional Impact, which is for those who don't know, it's a regional review of large scale developments that no longer exists. So have you seen sort of alternatives that cities or regions are using to sort of give that feedback and that little push to do cluster developments, or is the DRIs, that large scale review, sort of just a thing of the past?
It's getting into the policy side of things, which is not my strong area with when it gets into like review and sort of the codes.
Well, and that's fine, because actually that's kind of an introduction to one of the LID workshops that we're going to have next Tuesday, which is we're going to be talking about sort of those design manuals and the permitting, and we will go actually into restoration, because I worked for the county when that came through, and so I'll go through some of the incentives or the reasons why that cluster development type actually came to fruition. It took a lot of the planning and the technical expertise from folks like yourself. It also took political will, and so we'll talk about that next week. And something that's really interesting is that this whole talk we're talking about the cost effectiveness, and we're actually seeing cities like the city of Edgewater, who the city of Edgewater was the very first city in Volusia County to adopt these types of green printing concepts into their comprehensive plan, and so now, we're talking, 10, 15 years ago, when the city did that. And now, we're seeing them actually being approved for grants to do more because they have that in their document. So from a planning perspective, and we do have several city and local planners on this meeting today, those things, those seeds that we're planting, 10 years ago, even though there may not be a regulatory absolute requirement to do these types of techniques, there certainly are incentives that can be.
So I'll just take a moment to touch on one point. We work closely with the non-point source group at FDEP, and one of the projects we have going on is kind of developing sort of some statewide guidance on LID, GSI. But as part of that, one of the resources or tools that we're working on is a tool for auditing the local ordinances, for removing those barriers. And it's actually kind of adapting a tool that we found from Wisconsin Sea Grant, which always sounds like an oxymoron to me, but apparently the Great Lakes apply, and so they boarded that. And so anyway, but it kind of breaks it down into different categories, kind of walking through the comp plan or the ordinances that you have and looking for where are those barriers to implementing different types of LID and GSI. So that's something that's in the works that we hope to have available and maybe pilot testing in 2022.
That's fantastic. And that sort of leads into another question that we had in the chat, which is, can you explain again what you're going to do, or you're proposing to do with this training for maintenance of?
Yeah. So with the maintenance, one of the issues or the concerns that we have is that, okay, we're instead of having all the concentrated stormwater ponds, the approach would be to eventually we're increasing the number of practices in the landscape. Well, and it's like, okay, we have a hard enough time inspecting and maintaining the ponds. How are we going to do this GSI? Well, if you think about sort of the landscape maintenance who's doing that, well, we already have a training program in place that is required for landscape managers. They call the GIVMP program, and so it looks at training them. They have to be recertified for keeping grass clippings out of the storm drain system, making sure not to fertilize and put down pesticides in the wrong times of the year, things along those lines. And so providing the training to maintain fire retention cell, identifying when there's issues with permeable pavement, so that to call in somebody to actually come and do the repair or do a maintenance on it. That kind of training or those kind of activities can be done by someone who's mowing the grass and then walks by or weed whacking and sort of just happens to walk through or walk past the rain garden or all the rain gardens in the neighborhood. And then that they can be sort of the eyes on the ground and kind of see and inspect that. We foresee that it would be an additional, a valuable skill and certification that would hopefully increase their, essentially the amount of pay that they would be getting by being able to provide this service as well as doing landscape maintenance or your typical landscape maintenance.
That's excellent. And, Katrina Locke, who brings us this series, she hosted, almost a year and a half ago now, a whole series on certifications for green infrastructure best management practices in the area of Spring Hill, and, focusing on really a lot of the mom and pop landscape businesses, which gives them a competitive advantage when they're subbing out even for larger contracts. So I think that's going to be a really, really helpful tool. And I think it was Fred who mentioned that it might be something that we could even have at some of the local colleges? Is this something that you see your course? Is it something that people could get a credit for? Or how do you see that rollout going?
So right now, the way the GIV&P program works is that we have certain trainers or educators through the local extension offices. And that's sort of how that occurs. It doesn't, this type of program is early in its infancy, and it could evolve to become sort of more of a technical training. I mean, it kind of gets to a point where you get to a certain technical level, and it is appropriate for college areas, specifically for definitely at sort of the community college level. I think I would definitely see it fitting well there. An associate's degree and kind of fitting into that kind of level. Absolutely.
Excellent. And when you and I spoke previous to this meeting, you said something that really resonated, which is a takeaway for developers, builders, to maybe at least do a comparison, right?
Yeah.
Is that how you put it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Every site's going to be different, and the costs, you don't need to go through all of the individual intricacies and exact, out to the decimal place to kind of evaluate if this is going to be cost effective. I mean, if you look at it, kind of going back to those cost savings, it doesn't take much to kind of figure out that you're going to hit like a 20 or 40% cost savings on your green stormwater infrastructure. You can ballpark that. Okay, just going through a very simple, site assessment. Okay, what if we did this? Okay, we're going to shrink our development area by 50%. We're going to reduce our excavation costs by, let's ballpark it at 40%. Let's say we're going to do this. We're going to reduce our pipe length, our overall cost. Let's say maybe we're aggressive. We reduce it by 75%. It gives you a pretty good ballpark of whether this is going to pan out or not. And that can really, and it's not like that's maybe another billable hour, maybe two, but then the cost savings that you're providing to the client, I think that would be that would more than make up for that.
Excellent. And, we do have a lot of sort of city planners on here, and we have some engineers as well. And, I think something that that folks who work with local governments might be able to sort of empower this kind of development, LID and the GSI, is the fact that ultimately local governments will assume long-term maintenance of some of this infrastructure, right? And so your slide that showed, okay, replacement cost, right? So there's the maintenance costs, yes, and everybody looks at that, and everyone is very critical, but replacement, replacing green infrastructure is much less expensive than replacing gray infrastructure, right? Roads and sidewalks.
Yeah. It's essentially a liability for those communities that are taking on the responsibility of making sure the stormwater ponds are maintained. The cost there is, it's going to end up being higher than for the green infrastructure. The cost for maintaining green infrastructure, again, it depends on sort of your it depends on the types of infrastructure and sort of how large it is and things like that. There's going to be nuances like that. But as this becomes more common and become trainings and people, and it's less of a specialized, like, oh, this is the only group that does it. And more people have this training, are able to do it. Those costs are going to get, those are going to cumulatively come down and not be as significant. So the cost savings long term is going to be there. So.
Great. Well, we're right at like 8:15, and so I want to open it up. Anybody have any questions? You can, press your space bar and join the conversation, or raise your hand under your reaction icon at the bottom of your screen. And I'm also going to just quickly, I'm going to launch a poll for us as participants, and it's basically just identifying where our attendees are. And this, as Katrina mentioned at the beginning, is grant funded, and so something that is really valuable to grant recipients, as you probably well know, reporting back to the grantor, the agency that issues the grants, really is really important. And so this will help us share, where our participants are coming from. And so if you guys who are on the chat, if you could just click on where is your general location, West Volusia. So our cities like DeLand, DeBary, Orange City, Pearson. East Volusia would be, Daytona, New Smyrna Beach, Ormond Beach, Edgewater, Oak Hill. Florida generally, we've got some participants from outside of Volusia County, and then other. And you guys can, I think, see the results live. This isn't an anonymous poll, and so it's a pretty interesting breakdown there. So any questions from our folks? I'm just going to let this poll run for the next couple of minutes. Any questions?
I don't see a poll.
You don't see?
How do I see it?
Oh, let's see. Can you expand your view? Is there a way to toggle in the upper left-hand corner, red, yellow, and green dot? Maybe click green.
I saw it. Thank you. I got it. Thank you. I just saw it. If
Great.
you click up there.
Excellent.
I see Melissa's got her hand up for maybe a question.
Melissa, you're on mute.
Okay, I don't know why that wasn't working. Hit space bar and the mouse. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Bean, and also Katrina and Kelly. This has just been very timely and very, very important and very eye-opening. Thank you so very much. My question is a sort of different but related topic. As I've been listening this evening, I get excited about better development practices going forward, but I'm also, because of where I live geographically, aware of the absolute nightmare that is my mid-1960s and mid-1950s to mid-1960s developed area, the densest in Volusia County. And so we're having enough trouble figuring out how to get LID plus GIS going, given regulatory challenges and market forces, which we've discussed tonight. In the redevelopment front, are there, I guess, pervious surfaces is an opportunity. Grading, I don't know, are there opportunities? Some, it doesn't have to be, I know you don't have enough time to cover all of that, but are there opportunities with redevelopment?
Yes, I mean, so there's not, so what we're missing right now is a mechanism, a regulatory mechanism to require kind of to go back and fix some of those legacy issues. That may be addressed by, that's been a point that's come up with the stormwater TAC. Whether it gets implemented or not, we'll see. On the lot, there's probably, it's probably going to be an uphill battle. Okay, so if somebody basically has, if they redevelop their lot, they can go back to essentially the same imperviousness without, having to do anything additional. Where opportunity I see with municipalities to kind of to implement is in the right of way when there is utility work and leveraging the mobilization and the costs that are already implemented to, maybe you're doing a stormwater pipe replacement, maybe you're doing sewer pipe work, maybe you've just got to repave the road. there's a lot of heavy equipment and a lot of disturbance that's already in play, and to integrate green infrastructure in the right of way adjacent to that is a much lower cost oftentimes than doing that project independently or trying to implement that independently.
Thank you.
So I think that's where the opportunity is for local governments.
Thank you very much.
Melissa, that's a great question. And, you know, this is a challenge for local governments. If you're looking at areas like Midtown in Daytona Beach, where you've got historically areas that are low lying, that are flooding, that will become even more prone to flooding, and is really less served by the newer stormwater infrastructure. You know, the municipalities can over-engineer their stormwater systems, right? Because you've got a lot of areas that in some of these historic communities that were paved, so they're impervious well before there was ever a zoning code in the area. And so in order to redevelop, we have to manage that stormwater, and it's really difficult to put that burden, you know, on the individual property owner that had a historic development, and then all of these new developments are coming in around. So that's just for those who are on the, you know, in working for local governments, you know, please keep that in mind and raise that issue. And one other thing on the poll, which I'm going to end the poll here in a second, but it's interesting because people are chiming in the chat boxes. There are some folks that work on one side of the county but live on the other. So that's interesting.
Oh. Interesting breakdown there.
Somebody say something.
I was going to say, Kelly, did we lose you?
Nope. I was just downloading those results and wanted to make sure that I captured those results. So thank you all so much. And we do have more of these wonderful webinars coming up. So, you know, please stay tuned. We've got Dr. Cho on Thursday, and I'll send out an email to everyone who attended and send you the Zoom information. And we would invite you to bring a friend, right? We're trying to reach as wide an audience as possible. And Katrina, thank you so much for organizing this. These are seeds that you planted, you know, 5 years ago, in some cases for this. And Dr. Bean, thank you so much for sharing this information. I mean, really fantastic. And it's super helpful. And several people have contacted me already asking to watch the Zoom meeting. I know that there was a couple of meetings that ran really late today. So some folks weren't able to join us, but they did send me requests. So we will have this Zoom meeting online on the county's YouTube page. And Katrina, any last remarks?
No, I'd just like to, as you've already said, just thank you to Evan for tonight. This is a great presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you to you, Kelly, as well, for facilitating throughout, and a huge thank you as well to all the attendees, and you know, some great questions. Love seeing the chat and what's going on in the chat. Really interesting comments back and forth. And just, yeah, please join us as we move through the next week and a bit, and you know, come back for another one of these forums. And if you're not available, as Kelly said, don't forget the YouTube channel. We'll put them on there, so they'll be available at a later date. And I think also possibly through DEP as well, even later. So.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been great to join you all. It seems like a great effort that you have going on. And with our maintenance program, I need to follow up with Katrina on that. So
Eric,
Yeah.
thank you all so much. So with that, I'm actually going to stop the recording.